Some nights change everything. For Michael Thompson, a 35-year-old Uber driver grinding through another sleepless shift in downtown Chicago, October 15th started like any other. Bills piling up, his ex-wife's lawyer demanding more money, and his 7-year-old daughter Emma asking why Daddy couldn't come to her school play. But when a mysterious woman stepped into his Honda Civic at 2:30 a.m., clutching a flash drive and begging him to drive without asking questions, Michael had no idea he was about to become the most important person in a conspiracy that would shake the foundations of corporate America.
The rain hammered Michael's windshield like bullets as he sat in the Burger King parking lot, watching the clock on his phone tick past 2:15 a.m. 11 hours behind the wheel, and he barely made enough to cover gas. His back ached from the cheap seat cushion he bought at a dollar store, and his eyes burned from staring at Chicago's neon-soaked streets. The Uber app chimed, a pickup request from Millennium Park area, downtown where late-night rides usually meant trouble. Drunk college kids, cheating spouses, or worse. Michael's finger hovered over the decline button. His Honda Civic already had 2 small tears in the back seat from last month's passenger who'd gotten sick, and he couldn't afford another cleaning fee. But then he thought about Emma's school play next Friday, the one he'd promised to attend but couldn't unless he scraped together money for the custody lawyer. His ex-wife Jennifer had been clear, miss another payment to the lawyer, and weekend visits were off the table. Michael accepted the ride. The pickup location led him to a narrow alley between 2 office buildings. Streetlights flickered intermittently, casting dancing shadows that made the empty street feel like a scene from a crime movie. Michael checked his doors were unlocked, company policy, but kept his hand near the lock button. A woman emerged from the shadows, mid-20s, professional clothes soaked from rain, clutching a large purse against her chest like it contained her life savings. She moved with quick, jerky steps, constantly looking over her shoulder. When she reached the car, she yanked the door open and collapsed into the back seat. Michael turned to greet her, the standard Uber driver pleasantries ready on his tongue, but the words died when he saw her face. Pale, streaked with tears and rain, eyes wide with what could only be described as terror. She pressed a crumpled $100 bill against the partition. Her voice shook when she spoke. The destination she gave him was O'Hare Airport, a $40 ride on a good day. She was offering him more than double, in cash at 2:30 in the morning. Michael's street-smart instincts, honed from 2 years of driving nights in Chicago, screamed warning. This had all the hallmarks of trouble. Desperate passenger, overpayment, unusual hours, suspicious behavior. But the money was real, crisp in his fingers, and Emma's disappointed face from last month's soccer game flashed in his mind. He started the engine. As they pulled onto Lakeshore Drive, Michael studied his passenger in the rearview mirror. She sat rigidly upright, that purse still clutched to her chest, turning to look out the back window every few seconds. Her breathing was shallow, quick. Whatever had scared her wasn't just paranoia. Michael had seen scared passengers before. Domestic violence victims, fleeing abusive partners, teenagers running from home, people leaving jobs they shouldn't have taken. But something about this woman felt different. The clothes were expensive, the tailored blazer, designer shoes. The purse looked like it cost more than Michael made in a month. This wasn't someone running from personal drama. 10 minutes into the drive, she spoke again, her voice barely audible over the rain and road noise. She thanked him for not asking questions, said most people would have refused the ride. She told him her name was Sarah, though Michael suspected it wasn't real. Traffic was light at this hour, but Michael found himself taking a longer route, avoiding the main highways. Something about Sarah's behavior was contagious. He felt watched, exposed on the open road. When a dark sedan merged behind them from an on-ramp, maintaining the same speed and distance for several miles, that feeling intensified. Sarah noticed it too. She turned to look back, and Michael saw her face go even paler in the mirror. She told him to take the next exit. Michael's grip tightened on the steering wheel. This was exactly the kind of situation his brother Tony had warned him about when he'd started driving for Uber. Never deviate from the route. Never let passengers dictate where you drive. That's how drivers end up robbed or worse. But in Sarah's voice, not just fear but desperation made him signal for the exit. The sedan followed. As they wound through residential streets, Michael's mind raced. He could pull over, tell Sarah to get out, drive away, and forget this ever happened.
He had his own problems, his own life to worry about. Emma needed a father who was alive and present, not one who got mixed up in whatever trouble Sarah was running from. But when he looked in the mirror and saw Sarah's face, really saw it, not just the fear but the exhaustion, the resignation of someone who'd been running for too long, he thought about Emma again. What if someday his daughter needed help, and the only person who could provide it was a stranger, in a position to turn away? Michael made his choice. Instead of pulling over, he asked Sarah what was really going on. Her answer would change everything. Sarah's revelation hit Michael like a physical blow. She wasn't just any scared passenger. She was a forensic accountant who'd discovered her employer, Meridian Industries, had been embezzling disaster relief funds meant for hurricane victims. Funds that should have built homes were funding executive bonuses. Funds meant for hospital equipment were buying yachts. And she had proof. But what Michael didn't know yet was that Sarah wasn't just a whistleblower. She was the daughter of Meridian Industries' CEO, and the flash drive in her purse contained evidence that could send her own father to prison for life.
Sarah's hands trembled as she opened her purse, revealing a small flash drive wrapped in plastic. The simple device looked insignificant, but Michael could feel the weight of whatever secrets it contained pressing down on the car's interior like a physical presence. She explained her job at Meridian Industries, how she'd initially been hired for what seemed like routine financial auditing. The company specialized in disaster relief contracting, building temporary housing, delivering medical supplies, coordinating food distribution in areas hit by natural disasters. Noble work, she thought, work that mattered. But 3 weeks ago, while reviewing contracts for Hurricane Maria relief efforts in Puerto Rico, she'd noticed discrepancies. Small at first, invoices for materials that seemed overpriced, labor costs that didn't match industry standards. Sarah was thorough by nature, a trait that had served her well in forensic accounting. She dug deeper. What she found made her sick. Meridian had been systematically inflating costs and skimming the difference. A contract for $50 million in emergency housing had resulted in $15 million worth of actual construction, with the rest disappearing into shell companies and executive accounts. Medical supplies purchased for $20 million had cost the company $8 million, with the difference funding corporate retreats and luxury vehicles. But the worst part wasn't the theft. It was the human cost. Families were still living in FEMA trailers that should have been temporary, waiting for the permanent housing that Meridian had been paid to build but never constructed. Hospitals were operating with outdated equipment while executives bought vacation homes with the money meant for their life-saving machines. Sarah had spent 2 weeks compiling evidence, cross-referencing bank records, contractor receipts, and government contracts. The flash drive contained everything: financial records, email communications, even recorded phone calls where executives discussed the scheme openly, confident in their untouchability. Michael listened to her story while navigating increasingly narrow side streets, the sedan still maintaining its distance behind them. The weight of Sarah's revelations settled over him like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just corporate fraud. This was stealing from people who'd lost everything, people counting on help that would never come. But something in Sarah's story bothered him. The details were almost too perfect, too complete. How did junior forensic accountants gain access to executive communications and bank records? How'd she manage to compile such comprehensive evidence without anyone noticing? Before he could voice these questions, Sarah spotted something that made her gasp. The sedan behind them had been joined by a second vehicle, a black SUV that had appeared from a parallel street. Both vehicles were now following them, maintaining perfect formation. Sarah's breathing became rapid, panicked. She told Michael they needed to get to the FBI field office immediately, forget the airport. The evidence needed to reach federal agents before Meridian's security team found them. Michael's practical mind kicked in. If Sarah's story was true, if she really had evidence of massive federal contract fraud, then the people following them weren't just corporate security. They were people with resources, connections, and a lot to lose. People who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate witnesses. He made a sharp right turn without signaling, tires squealing on wet asphalt. The sedan and SUV followed, no longer maintaining their careful distance. This was no longer surveillance, it was pursuit. Michael's hands were steady on the wheel, muscle memory from his younger days taking over. Before Emma, before Jennifer, before the steady decline into financial struggle, he'd been different. Street racing wasn't something he advertised on his Uber profile, but the skills remained. He knew Chicago's street grid like most people knew their own homes. He accelerated through a yellow light, taking a hard left onto a one-way street. The sedan tried to follow, but had to brake hard to avoid oncoming traffic. The SUV continued on the main road, probably trying to cut them off at the next intersection. Sarah was making phone calls now, her voice urgent but hushed. She was trying to reach someone at the FBI, but it was nearly 3 a.m. Even federal agents slept sometimes. Each call went to voicemail, each message adding to the desperate edge in her voice. Michael found himself oddly calm despite the circumstances. Maybe it was the familiar feel of high-stakes driving, or maybe it was the clarity that came with finally having a purpose beyond just surviving day to day. For the first time in months, he felt like he was doing something that mattered. They'd lost the sedan, but the SUV reappeared in his mirrors, having successfully predicted their route. These people knew what they were doing. Michael realized they needed more than just driving skills. They needed a plan. Sarah mentioned a contact at the Chicago Tribune, an investigative journalist who had been working on corporate fraud cases. If they couldn't reach the FBI, maybe they could get the story to the press, make it public before Meridian could cover it up. But first, they had to stay alive long enough to make that happen. Michael took another sharp turn, this time into an industrial area near the Chicago River. Warehouses and loading docks stretched out on both sides, most dark and empty at this hour. It was isolated, which could work for or against them, depending on what their pursuers intended. The SUV accelerated, clearly trying to ram them or force them to stop. Michael pressed the Honda's aging engine harder than he had in years, coaxing every bit of speed from the four-cylinder motor. The gap between them widened slightly, but he knew it wouldn't last. The SUV was newer, more powerful, and probably armored. Sarah's phone finally connected. She was talking rapidly to someone, explaining the situation, giving their location. Michael caught fragments of the conversation. Something about meeting at a secure location, about protection, about getting the evidence to the right people. But as Sarah hung up, Michael noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the brief moment when the phone screen was illuminated, he saw the contact name she'd been calling. It wasn't an FBI agent or a journalist. It was someone named Dad. Michael's world tilted as the pieces clicked into place. Sarah hadn't been calling for help. She'd been reporting their location to someone she trusted implicitly. But if her dad was involved with Meridian Industries, if he was part of the corruption she claimed to be exposing, then Sarah wasn't the whistleblower she appeared to be. She was either the most naive person alive, or she was playing a game Michael didn't understand, and the people chasing them might not be trying to silence her, they might be trying to protect her from something far worse than corporate fraud.
Quick pause. Before we continue, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing.
Michael's mind reeled as he processed what he'd seen. Sarah was calling someone named Dad while supposedly running from corporate assassins. The implications crashed over him like cold water, each possibility worse than the last. Sarah ended the call and immediately seemed to relax slightly, some of the desperate tension leaving her shoulders. She told Michael help was coming, that they just needed to stay ahead of their pursuers for another few minutes. But Michael was no longer focused on the SUV in his mirrors. His attention was locked on Sarah, reevaluating everything she'd told him. The expensive clothes, the comprehensive evidence, the perfect knowledge of Meridian's operations, it all made sense if she wasn't just an employee. He needed to know the truth. Without warning, Michael yanked the steering wheel hard right, tires screaming as they skidded into an empty parking garage. He drove up to the second level before stopping, the Honda's engine ticking as it cooled. The SUV's headlights swept past the garage entrance below, but didn't follow. They'd lost their pursuers, at least temporarily.
Sarah started to thank him for the evasive driving, but Michael cut him off. He turned in his seat to face her directly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. He confronted her about the phone call, about calling Dad instead of the FBI or police. He'd heard enough lies in his life, from his ex-wife about their finances, from his former employer about job security, from himself about how he was handling single parenthood. He knew what deception sounded like. Sarah's facade crumbled like wet paper. The tears came first, not the careful tears of earlier, the deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere primal. She doubled over in the back seat, clutching that expensive purse like it was the only solid thing in her universe. When she finally spoke, her voice was completely different, younger, more vulnerable, stripped of the desperate authority she'd carried before. Sarah Williams wasn't just any forensic accountant at Meridian Industries. She was Sarah Meridian, daughter of CEO Thomas Meridian, the man who'd built the company from nothing 30 years ago, who'd been featured on magazine covers as a champion of humanitarian aid, who'd personally handed her diploma at her graduation from Northwestern University, the man who, she discovered 3 weeks ago, had been systematically stealing from disaster victims for over 5 years. The revelation changed everything Michael thought he understood about their situation. This wasn't corporate whistleblowing. This was a daughter discovering her father was a monster and trying to find the courage to turn him in. Sarah explained that she'd taken the job at Meridian specifically to work close to her father, to learn the business from the ground up. Thomas had always pushed her toward business, toward joining the family company, toward carrying on his legacy. She'd wanted to make him proud. Instead, she'd found evidence that her father had personally authorized the theft of hundreds of millions of dollars in disaster relief funds, money meant for hurricane victims in Puerto Rico, earthquake survivors in Mexico, flood victims in Louisiana, money that desperate people were counting on that could mean the difference between life and death. But worse than the theft was the callousness. Sarah had found emails where her father joked about the gullible government idiots who kept awarding Meridian contracts. Messages where he and other executives laughed about disaster victims being too stupid and desperate to ask questions. One email had particularly haunted her. Thomas Meridian discussing a delayed housing project in Texas, writing that a few more months in FEMA trailers won't kill them, and the longer we delay, the more profit margin we maintain. Sarah printed everything, copied files, recorded phone conversations. She'd spent sleepless nights building an airtight case against her own father, knowing that exposing him would destroy not just him, but her mother, her younger brother still in college, everyone who worked for the company. And she'd been paralyzed by the choice. For 2 weeks, she carried the evidence, unable to move forward, unable to go back. She'd called in sick to work, ignored her father's calls, hidden in her apartment trying to find the courage to destroy her family to save strangers. Tonight had been different. Her father had come to her apartment, demanding to know why she'd been avoiding him, why she'd been asking questions about specific contracts. Thomas Meridian hadn't built a billion-dollar company by being naive. He'd suspected someone was investigating him, and Sarah's behavior had made her the obvious candidate. The confrontation had been ugly. Thomas searched her apartment, found some of the evidence, realized the scope of what she'd uncovered. He'd pleaded with her, then threatened her, then pleaded again. He talked about family loyalty, about protecting the people who depended on Meridian for jobs, about how exposing the fraud would hurt innocent employees more than guilty executives. But what had finally driven Sarah from the apartment wasn't her father's words. It was the phone call he'd made while standing in her living room. She'd heard him instructing someone to handle the situation quietly and make sure there are no loose ends. Her father, the man who taught her to ride a bike and helped her with homework and walked her down the aisle at her cousin's wedding, had just ordered her death. She'd escaped through a window, taken the fire escape to the alley, and called the first Uber she could find. The evidence was on the flash drive, but she'd also uploaded copies to a cloud storage account with instructions to release everything if she didn't check in every 12 hours. The people following them weren't trying to kill her on her father's orders. They were trying to bring her home so Thomas could convince her to destroy the evidence and disappear quietly. Her father still believed he could control the situation, could make this go away with the right combination of money and family pressure. He was wrong. Sarah told Michael she'd called her father to arrange a meeting, but not to surrender. She'd lied to him about her location, about being willing to discuss a solution. What she'd really done was buy them time while her real backup plan activated. 3 hours ago, she'd sent everything to WikiLeaks, to the Washington Post, to the FBI, and to attorneys general in every state where Meridian had contracts. The uploads were scheduled to complete at 6 a.m. with or without her alive to see it. Her father didn't know that yet, but he would soon. Michael sat in stunned silence, processing this new version of events. Sarah wasn't just brave, she was willing to sacrifice everything, including her life, to expose her father's crimes. She'd planned her own death to ensure justice was done. But she'd also potentially dragged Michael into a situation that could get him killed as collateral damage. Before he could respond, Sarah's phone rang. The caller ID showed Dad again. Sarah looked at Michael with eyes that were no longer panicked, but grimly determined. She answered the call, putting it on speaker so Michael could hear. Thomas Meridian's voice filled the Honda's interior, cultured and calm, with just the edge of controlled anger. He told Sarah he knew she was in an Uber, that his people had the license plate, that he knew exactly where they were. What he said next made Michael's blood freeze. He knew Michael's full name, his address, his daughter's school, his ex-wife's workplace. He knew Emma had a soccer game this Saturday and a school play next Friday. Thomas Meridian was offering Michael a choice: deliver Sarah to a specified location within the hour and receive $50,000 cash plus guaranteed employment at Meridian Industries. Refuse and face the consequences of interfering with family business. The threat was clear without being explicit. Michael could help them, or he could watch everything he cared about disappear. Sarah stared at Michael across the dark interior of the Honda, waiting to see what kind of man she'd entrusted with her life. Michael stared at the phone as Thomas Meridian's offer hung in the air like poison gas. $50,000 would solve every financial problem he had, would guarantee Emma's security, would give him the stable life he'd been fighting for since the divorce. All he had to do was drive Sarah to her father and pretend this night never happened. But as he looked at Sarah's face in the dim light, not the desperate stranger who'd gotten in his car, but a young woman who'd sacrificed everything to do what was right, Michael realized the choice wasn't about money or threats. It was about the kind of man he wanted his daughter to see when she looked at him. And Thomas Meridian was about to learn that some people couldn't be bought.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The silence in the Honda stretched like a taut wire, broken only by the distant hum of Chicago's late-night traffic and Thomas Meridian's measured breathing through the phone's speaker. Michael felt the weight of the choice pressing down on him, each second of hesitation potentially costing him everything he'd worked to build since his divorce. $50,000. The number echoed in his mind like a siren song. It would pay off the custody lawyer, catch up on his car payments, cover Emma's school supplies and clothes for the next 2 years. It would buy him stability, security, the chance to be the father Emma deserved instead of the tired, broke man who kept disappointing her. But as Michael studied Sarah's face in the rearview mirror, he saw something that made him remember why he'd started driving for Uber in the first place. Not the money, though he desperately needed it, but the simple act of helping people get where they needed to go, of being useful, necessary, trusted. Sarah had trusted him with her life, and now she was waiting to see if that trust had been misplaced. Michael thought about Emma, about the bedtime stories he'd read her during his weekend visits, about the fairy tales where heroes faced impossible choices and somehow found the courage to do what was right. He thought about the man he wanted to be when Emma looked back on her childhood, the values he wanted to teach her through his actions rather than his words. Thomas Meridian's voice came through the speaker again, impatient now. He wanted an answer. He reminded Michael that he had resources, connections, ways of making life very difficult for people who opposed him.
The threat was still wrapped in civilized language, but the meaning was clear. Michael reached over and ended the call. Sarah's eyes widened in surprise and something that might have been relief. She started to thank him, but Michael held up a hand. He wasn't done making choices yet. He told Sarah they needed to change their approach. Running wasn't working. Thomas Meridian had too many resources, too much reach. They needed to get ahead of the situation, control it instead of being controlled by it. Michael had learned something important during his 2 years driving nights in Chicago. Sometimes the best way to deal with predators was to become unpredictable, to do something they didn't expect. He started the Honda and drove deeper into the parking garage, finding a spot on the 4th level where they'd be invisible from the street. Then he asked Sarah to walk him through her evidence again, but this time with specific details: names, dates, amounts, locations. As Sarah explained the scope of Meridian Industries' fraud, Michael began to understand why Thomas was so desperate to stop her. This wasn't just about stealing money. It was about a systematic betrayal of public trust that would destroy lives and careers across multiple industries and government agencies. The hurricane relief fraud in Puerto Rico had left thousands of families in substandard housing that was already falling apart after 2 years. The earthquake response contracts in Mexico had resulted in medical supplies that were expired or counterfeit, causing preventable deaths in overwhelmed hospitals. The flood response in Louisiana had seen emergency shelters built with materials so cheap that they'd started collapsing within months, forcing evacuees back into damaged homes before they were safe to inhabit. But the most damning evidence was personal. Sarah had recorded a phone conversation where her father had laughed about a delayed hospital construction project in Texas, joking that a few more dead hurricane victims would just mean a few more less people to complain about our work. Michael felt sick listening to the details, but he also felt something else: clarity. This wasn't about Sarah's family drama or corporate politics. This was about justice for people who had no voice, no power, no recourse when the system designed to help them failed. He made a second choice of the night. Instead of heading to the FBI field office or trying to contact journalists, he drove to a place Thomas Meridian wouldn't expect: the Chicago Police Department's 1st District Station. Not because he thought local cops could handle federal contract fraud, but because he knew they could protect Sarah long enough for her evidence to reach the right people. The 1st District is located in the South Loop, well lit and busy even at 3:30 a.m. Michael parked directly in front of the building, under the bright lights where anyone trying to grab Sarah would be visible to dozens of witnesses and security cameras. But before they went inside, Michael had one more idea. He asked Sarah to call her father again, but this time to tell him exactly where they were and what they were about to do. Not to negotiate or surrender, but to give him a choice of his own. Sarah looked confused, but Michael explained his reasoning. Thomas Meridian was desperate because he thought he could still control the situation, still find a way to make this disappear quietly. But if Sarah publicly surrendered herself to police protection, if she walked into a building full of cops and federal communication equipment, then the situation would be officially out of Thomas's control. At that point, his father would have 2 choices: let the investigation proceed and hope his lawyers could minimize the damage, or escalate to violence and guarantee that he'd face murder charges on top of fraud. Thomas Meridian was a criminal, but he was also a businessman. He understood cost-benefit analysis. Sarah made the call. Thomas Meridian's reaction was immediate and explosive. Gone was the controlled, cultured voice Merlier. This was a man watching his empire crumble in real time, lashing out with threats and promises and desperate bargaining. He told Sarah she was destroying not just him, but everyone who worked for Meridian Industries, thousands of jobs that would disappear when the company collapsed. He reminded her that her mother would be left with nothing, that her brother would be expelled from Northwestern when the tuition payment stopped, that her own trust fund and inheritance would evaporate. But then, as his fury exhausted itself, Thomas Meridian did something unexpected. He started crying. Not the manipulative tears of someone trying to avoid consequences, but the broken sobs of a man who'd finally realized what he'd become. He told Sarah he loved her, that he'd never intended for things to go this far, that the first fraudulent contract had been a desperate attempt to save the company during a cash flow crisis, and everything after that had been trying to cover up that initial crime. He asked her to forgive him.
Sarah listened to his father's breakdown with tears streaming down her own face. When he finished, she told him he did forgive him, that he loved him too, but that forgiveness didn't mean he could escape the consequences of his choices. She told him that in 30 minutes, she would walk into the police station and ask for protective custody while federal agents examined her evidence. She suggested he use that time to call his own lawyers and begin negotiating his surrender, because running would only make things worse for everyone. Then she hung up. Michael and Sarah sat in the Honda for a few more minutes, both of them processing what had just happened. Sarah wasn't just turning in her father, she was watching her entire world collapse, knowing that she'd been the one to push it over the edge. But she was also finally free. As they prepared to walk into the police station, Sarah asked Michael why he'd helped her. She could have offered him money, could have threatened him, could have appealed to his conscience with stories of disaster victims, but she never actually asked him to risk his life and his daughter's security for a stranger. Michael's answer surprised even him. He told Sarah about Emma, about the bedtime stories and fairy tales, about wanting to be the kind of man his daughter could be proud of. But more than that, he told her about the realization that had hit him somewhere between the parking garage and the police station, that he'd been so focused on surviving day to day that he'd forgotten what it felt like to actually live. For the first time in months, maybe years, Michael felt like himself again. Not the desperate, divorced dad struggling to make rent, not the failed IT worker driving strangers around for pocket change, but the man he'd been before life had beaten him down. The man who would have helped Sarah even if she couldn't pay him, even if it meant risking everything, because helping people was what decent human beings did. Sarah smiled then, the first genuine smile Michael had seen from her all night. She told him that walking into that police station was the scariest thing she had ever done, but also the most relieved she had felt since discovering her father's crimes. Together, they walked towards the bright lights of the 1st District station, ready to face whatever came next. As Michael and Sarah approached the glass doors of the police station, emergency vehicles suddenly flooded the street behind them. FBI, Chicago PD, even news vans that seemed to have appeared from nowhere. Michael realized that Sarah's 6 a.m. dead man switch wasn't her only insurance policy. She'd triggered something much bigger than a simple surrender to local police. Thomas Meridian wasn't just losing his daughter tonight. He was about to discover that the family business he'd built his empire on was connected to something that would make corporate fraud look like a parking ticket. And Michael was about to learn that driving Sarah to safety was only the beginning of the most important night of his life.
The moment Michael and Sarah stepped through the glass doors of the 1st District station, they walked into controlled chaos. Federal agents and FBI windbreakers moved with precise efficiency, setting up communication equipment and transforming the police station into a command center. News crews gathered outside, their camera lights turning the street into an impromptu stage. Michael realized this wasn't a spontaneous response to Sarah's surrender. This was a coordinated operation that had been planned for weeks, possibly months. Detective Maria Rodriguez approached them immediately, but she wasn't alone. Behind her walked a tall man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Assistant Director James Chen from the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. Sarah wasn't just a whistleblower. She was the key witness in a federal investigation that had been building a case against Meridian Industries for over a year. Chen explained that Sarah's evidence hadn't just exposed her father's fraud, it had provided the missing pieces in a much larger conspiracy. Meridian Industries was part of a network of companies systematically defrauding federal disaster relief programs, a scheme that stretched across multiple states and involved dozens of politicians, contractors, and government officials. The total amount stolen wasn't the millions Sarah had discovered. It was over $2 billion in relief funds meant for disaster victims across the United States. Sarah stared at Chen in shock. She'd thought she was exposing her father's crimes, not uncovering a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and business. The flash drive she'd been clutching all night contained evidence that could bring down senators, governors, cabinet officials, and corporate executives across multiple industries. But Chen had more revelations.
Sarah's father wasn't the mastermind of the conspiracy. He was a mid-level player who'd been recruited specifically because of his company's reputation and his daughter's expertise in forensic accounting. The real architects of the fraud had been using Sarah without her knowledge. They'd placed her in the position at Meridian Industries, fed her carefully selected information, and guided her investigation toward her father while concealing their own involvement. Sarah hadn't stumbled across the evidence by accident. She'd been maneuvered into finding it. Michael felt the ground shifting beneath him as Chen continued. Sarah's dramatic escape tonight, the phone call to her father, even her route to the police station, all of it had been monitored and guided by federal agents who'd been watching Sarah for months, waiting for her to gather enough evidence to make their case. The people following them in the sedan and SUV hadn't been Thomas Meridian's security team. They'd been FBI agents providing protection while maintaining the illusion that Sarah was in danger. Sarah looked stunned, betrayed, as if she'd discovered her entire life had been a performance staged by strangers. She asked Chen if anything about her situation had been real, if her father's crimes were just part of some elaborate federal sting operation. Chen's answer was both reassuring and terrifying. Thomas Meridian's crimes were completely real. He had stolen millions from disaster relief funds, had authorized the construction of substandard housing and medical facilities, had personally profited from human suffering. The evidence Sarah had gathered was legitimate and damning. But Thomas Meridian had also been a victim of the larger conspiracy. He'd been recruited by people who promised to make his financial problems disappear if he'd cooperate with their disaster relief network. When he'd started asking questions or expressing concerns about the scope of the fraud, they'd used his existing crimes as leverage to force deeper cooperation. By the time Thomas realized he was trapped in something much larger and more dangerous than corporate fraud, escape was impossible. The conspiracy's leaders had evidence of his crimes and wouldn't hesitate to use it if he tried to back out or expose them. Sarah's investigation had threatened not just her father, but the entire network. When the conspiracy's leaders realized she was getting close to the truth, they made a decision that explained everything about the night's events. They decided to eliminate the threat by sacrificing Thomas Meridian. The plan was elegant in its cruelty. Allow Sarah to expose her father, let him take the fall for the entire conspiracy, then use his disgrace and destruction to discredit any evidence that might point toward the real perpetrators. Thomas would be painted as a rogue contractor who'd exploited his daughter's love and trust to cover his crimes, and the larger network would remain hidden. But FBI agents had been watching, gathering their own evidence, waiting for the right moment to expose not just Thomas Meridian, but everyone involved in the conspiracy. Sarah's escape tonight had triggered the final phase of the federal investigation. Her evidence, combined with the FBI's own surveillance and financial records, provided an airtight case against the entire network. Chen showed them photographs of the real conspiracy leaders, senators who directed relief contracts to specific companies, cabinet officials who'd fast-tracked approvals for fraudulent projects, corporate executives who'd coordinated the distribution of stolen funds across multiple states and disaster zones. Michael listened to this explanation with growing unease. If the FBI had been watching Sarah for months, if they'd known about the conspiracy and her father's involvement, why had they allowed her to live in fear? Why had they let her believe she was alone, that her life was in danger, that she was betraying her family? Chen's answer revealed the final, most disturbing truth about the night's events. The federal investigation had reached a point where they needed Sarah to make specific choices under genuine pressure. They needed her to choose justice over family loyalty, truth over personal safety, principle over financial security. Those choices had to be real, uncoerced, documented, and legally admissible in court. If Sarah had known she was protected, if she'd understood the scope of the investigation, if she'd realized her father was also a victim of the larger conspiracy, she might have made different choices. She might have tried to protect her father, might have negotiated some kind of deal, might have compromised the investigation's integrity. The FBI had needed Sarah to be genuinely terrified, genuinely isolated, genuinely convinced that exposing her father was her only option. They'd needed her choices to be authentic enough to withstand the scrutiny of defense attorneys who'd argue that she had been manipulated or coerced by federal agents. Sarah stared at Chen with a mixture of rage and horror. She'd spent weeks in agony, had prepared to die for her principles, had destroyed her relationship with her father and potentially her entire family, all while federal agents watched and took notes for their case files. But Chen wasn't finished. He had one more revelation that would change everything Michael understood about the night. Michael Thompson wasn't a random Uber driver who'd gotten caught up in Sarah's escape. He was a specifically selected participant in the federal operation. The FBI had been monitoring Thomas Meredian's communications for months. They'd known he'd try to intercept Sarah when she attempted to expose him, had known he'd use his resources and connections to track her down. They'd needed someone to help Sarah reach safety, someone whose presence would force Thomas Meredian to reveal the full extent of his criminal network. Michael's financial troubles, his custody battle, his need for money, all of it had been documented in the FBI's background check. They'd identified him as someone who could be trusted to help Sarah, but who'd also be vulnerable to Thomas Meredian's threats and bribes. The Uber ride request at 2:30 a.m. wasn't random. Sarah had been instructed to call for a ride from that specific location at that specific time, knowing Michael would be the closest available driver. Michael felt sick as the implications sank in. His choice to help Sarah, his decision to risk his daughter's security for a stranger's safety, none of it had been as spontaneous or heroic as he'd believed. He'd been manipulated just as thoroughly as Sarah, played like a chess piece in someone else's game. But then Chen said something that surprised both Michael and Sarah. The federal agents had predicted Michael's initial response to Sarah's situation. They'd expected him to be suspicious, cautious, focused on his own problems rather than a stranger's crisis. Their psychological profile had suggested he'd take Sarah's money and drive her to the airport without getting involved, maybe call police anonymously after dropping her off. What they hadn't predicted was Michael's decision to stay involved after learning the truth about Sarah's situation. His choice to help her confront her father, his refusal to accept Thomas Meredian's bribe, his idea to use the police station as protection, none of that had been part of the FBI's plan. Those choices had been entirely his own, made under real pressure with real consequences, and those choices had impressed federal investigators enough that they were offering him something unprecedented. Chen extended an offer to Michael, a position as a federal informant working undercover in situations where the FBI needed someone with his specific combination of street knowledge, driving skills, and moral flexibility.
The pay would be substantial, the work dangerous but meaningful, and the impact on cases like Sarah's potentially enormous. Michael could continue being an Uber driver while secretly working for the federal government, helping to expose corruption and protect people like Sarah who found themselves caught in impossible situations. Or he could walk away, return to his regular life, and pretend this night had never happened. But before Michael could answer, Sarah made a choice of her own. She told Chen that she wanted Michael to know something the FBI apparently hadn't included in their psychological profile. During the hours they'd spent together, she'd seen qualities in Michael that made her trust him with her life. Not because she was desperate or had no other options, but because she recognized someone who understood what it meant to sacrifice for people you cared about. Michael had risked his daughter's security and his own safety for for a complete stranger, not because federal agents had manipulated him into that position, but because when faced with a choice between personal safety and doing what was right, he'd chosen to do what was right. That choice, Sarah said, was worth more than all the evidence and surveillance and careful planning the FBI had invested in their operation. As dawn began to break over Chicago, Michael realized that the most important decision of his life wasn't whether to accept Chen's offer or return to driving for Uber. It was whether to forgive himself for being manipulated or to take pride in the choices he'd made despite that manipulation. But Michael's decision would have to wait. Through the police station's windows, they could see Thomas Meridian's black Mercedes pulling up to the curb, followed by a convoy of news vans and federal vehicles. Sarah's father had come to surrender himself, but he wasn't alone. Stepping out of the passenger seat was someone Michael recognized from newspaper photos. Senator Patricia Walsh, chair of the Senate Committee on Homeland Security. If the senator was personally involved in Thomas Meridian's surrender, then the conspiracy Chen had described was about to become a public spectacle that would reach the highest levels of government, and Michael was about to discover that his night as an Uber driver had made him a key witness in the biggest political scandal in decades.
Thomas Meridian looked like a man who'd aged a decade in the span of a few hours. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and his eyes red with exhaustion and tears. But he walked into the police station with his shoulders straight, maintaining whatever dignity he could salvage from the wreckage of his life. Senator Patricia Walsh entered beside him, her presence commanding immediate attention from the federal agents and police officers in the station. Her appearance alongside Thomas Meridian sent a clear message. This case had implications that reached far beyond corporate fraud. Sarah watched her father approach with a mixture of love and heartbreak that made Michael's chest ache. Despite everything Thomas had done, despite the betrayal and the threats and the stolen money, he was still the man who'd raised her, who taught her the values that had ultimately led to his downfall. Thomas stopped a few feet away from Sarah, his eyes taking in her tear-stained face and the federal agents surrounding her. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, defeated, but also strangely relieved. He told Sarah he was proud of her, not for exposing his crimes or destroying his company, but for having the courage to do what he should have done years ago. He'd known the disaster relief fraud was wrong from the beginning, had known that every dollar stolen meant real suffering for real people who desperately needed help. But he'd been weak, had chosen the easy path of rationalization and self-justification rather than facing the consequences of his actions. Sarah had been stronger than he'd ever been, had chosen justice over comfort, truth over family loyalty, principle over personal security. She'd made the choices he should have made, had shown the courage he never possessed. Thomas turned to Michael then, extending his hand in a gesture that surprised everyone in the room. He thanked Michael for protecting his daughter, for helping her reach safety when her own father had failed her. He apologized for the threats, for trying to buy Michael's cooperation, for putting his family at risk. But most importantly, he told Michael that Sarah had chosen well when she trusted him. In a night full of deception and manipulation, Michael's choices had been genuine, motivated by decency rather than calculation. The formal proceedings that followed were anticlimactic after the emotional intensity of the family reunion. Thomas Meridian surrendered himself to federal custody, waiving his right to an attorney until he could negotiate a cooperation agreement. Senator Walsh announced her resignation from the Senate and her intention to cooperate fully with the federal investigation. Over the following hours, as dawn gave way to morning and the police station filled with lawyers and journalists and federal prosecutors, the scope of the conspiracy became clear. The disaster relief fraud had involved dozens of companies, hundreds of government contracts, and stolen funds that totaled nearly $3 billion. The human cost was even staggering. Thousands of families were still living in substandard housing that should have been temporary, waiting for the permanent solutions that had been paid for but never delivered. Hospitals were operating with outdated equipment, while executives had used relief funds to purchase luxury items. Emergency shelters had collapsed, medical supplies had proven defective, and reconstruction projects had been abandoned halfway to completion. But the conspiracy's exposure also meant that real relief was finally coming. The federal government had announced emergency funding to complete the abandoned projects, to replace the defective supplies, to provide the aid that victims had been promised years earlier.
Sarah's courage had not only exposed the criminals who'd stolen from disaster victims, it had also ensured that those victims would finally receive the help they desperately needed. As the formal proceedings concluded, and Sarah was released into federal protection pending the trials that would follow, she found Michael in the parking lot outside the police station. He was leaning against his Honda Civic, looking exhausted but oddly peaceful for a man whose life had been turned upside down in a single night. Sarah asked him if he decided what to do about Agent Chen's offer to work as a federal informant. The pay would be good, the work meaningful, and his skills clearly valuable to law enforcement. Michael's answer surprised her. He told Sarah he'd already made his decision, but it wasn't about Chen's offer. It was about something more fundamental, about the kind of life he wanted to live and the kind of man he wanted to be for his daughter Emma. For months, Michael had been focused on survival, on making enough money to keep his head above water, on meeting the minimum requirements to maintain his relationship with Emma. He'd been living defensively, reactively, letting circumstances dictate his choices rather than making choices that reflected his values. But somewhere between picking up a terrified stranger and walking into a police station surrounded by federal agents, Michael had remembered something important. Survival wasn't enough. Emma didn't need a father who could just pay his bills and show up for scheduled visits. She needed a father who stood for something, who made choices based on principle rather than convenience, who could be proud of the example he set for her. Michael told Sarah he was going to continue driving for Uber, at least for now. Not because it was lucrative or fulfilling, but because it was honest work that let him help people in small ways every day. Some nights he'd drive partygoers home safely. Some nights he'd help someone get to the hospital during an emergency, and some nights he might encounter someone like Sarah who needed help more than they needed a ride. He was also going to accept Chen's offer, but with conditions. He'd work as an informant when his skills were needed and when the cases mattered, but he wouldn't let federal work consume his life or compromise his relationship with Emma. She would always come first, but that didn't mean he had to choose between being a good father and being a good man. Sarah smiled and told Michael she thought Emma was lucky to have him as a father. Not because he could solve all her problems or give her everything she wanted, but because he was the kind of man who would risk everything to help a stranger in need. That example, Sarah said, was worth more than any amount of money or security he could provide. As they prepared to go their separate ways, Sarah to federal protection and eventual testimony, Michael to his regular life with a new understanding of what that life could mean, Sarah asked him one final question. She wanted to know if he regretted getting involved, if he wished he'd just driven her to the airport and collected his fare like any other passenger. Michael's answer came without hesitation. He told Sarah that the past 6 hours had been the most terrifying, dangerous, and stressful of his entire life. He'd been threatened, manipulated, used as a pawn in someone else's game, and forced to make choices that could have destroyed everything he cared about. But they'd also been the most meaningful 6 hours of his life in recent memory. For the first time since his divorce, since losing his job, since starting the long slide into financial desperation, Michael felt like himself again. Not the broken-down version of himself that had been struggling just to survive, but the man he had always intended to be, someone who helped people, who stood up for what was right, who could be trusted to do the right thing even when it was difficult.
That feeling, Michael realized, was what had been missing from his life for so long. Not money or stability or security, but the simple knowledge that his choices mattered, that his actions had meaning beyond just getting through another day. Sarah had given him that gift by trusting him with her life, and no amount of federal manipulation or corporate threats could take that away from him. 6 months later, Michael was still driving for Uber, but his life had changed in ways both dramatic and subtle. The federal investigation had resulted in dozens of arrests and convictions, with Thomas Meridian receiving a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation. Sarah had testified before Congress and become a prominent advocate for disaster relief reform. Michael had worked on 3 cases as a federal informant, helping to expose a human trafficking ring, a prescription drug fraud scheme, and a series of financial scams targeting elderly victims. The work was dangerous but rewarding, and it had given him a sense of purpose that complemented his role as Emma's father. Emma, now 8 years old, didn't know the details of what her father did during his night shifts, but she'd noticed changes in him. He was more confident, more present during their weekend visits, more willing to talk about important things like courage and justice and doing the right thing even when it was hard.
During one of their weekend visits, Emma had asked him why he seemed different lately, why he smiled more and worried less than he used to. Michael had thought about her question for a long time before answering. Finally, he told her that he'd learned something important about being a grown-up, that the best way to take care of the people you love was to be someone they could be proud of, someone who stood for something bigger than just himself. Emma had nodded seriously and told him she was proud of him, even though she didn't always understand what he did for work. That conversation had meant more to Michael than any amount of money or recognition he could have received for his role in exposing the disaster relief conspiracy. As he drove through Chicago's streets on another late-night shift, Michael reflected on the changes in his life since that October night when Sarah had gotten into his Honda Civic. He was still struggling financially, still working long hours, still fighting to maintain his relationship with Emma despite the challenges of divorce and shared custody. But he was no longer just surviving. He was living with purpose, making choices that reflected his values rather than just his circumstances. He was the kind of man his daughter could look up to, the kind of man who could be trusted to do the right thing when it mattered most. And sometimes, late at night when his phone chimed with a new ride request from an unfamiliar location, Michael found himself hoping that another person in need might climb into his back seat, giving him another chance to prove that ordinary people could still do extraordinary things when they chose courage over convenience, justice over safety, and principle over profit. Because in the end, that's what the night with Sarah had taught him, that the most important moments in life often came disguised as ordinary circumstances, and that the difference between a meaningful life and a wasted one was simply the willingness to recognize those moments and act on them when they arrived. Michael Thompson was still an Uber driver, still a divorced father struggling to make ends meet, still just another face in Chicago's vast urban landscape. But he was also a man who had chosen to be better than his circumstances, who had discovered that heroism wasn't about being fearless or powerful or wealthy. It was about being willing to help when help was needed, regardless of the personal cost. And that knowledge had changed everything.
The notification on Michael's phone came at exactly 2:30 a.m., 1 year to the day after Sarah had first climbed into his Honda Civic. The pickup location was familiar, the same downtown alley where everything had started, where his life had taken a turn he never could have imagined. Michael had been expecting this call. Sarah had been released from federal protection 3 months earlier, after the final trials had concluded and the last of the conspiracy members had been sentenced. Thomas Meridian was serving 8 years in minimum security federal prison, though he'd likely be released in 5 with good behavior. His cooperation had been instrumental in securing convictions against 17 other defendants, including Senator Walsh and 3 cabinet-level officials. The disaster relief funds had been recovered and redistributed to their intended recipients. New oversight mechanisms had been implemented to prevent similar fraud. Sarah had been awarded a settlement that made her financially independent for life, though she donated most of it to organizations helping disaster victims. But more importantly, Sarah had found something she'd never expected during those dark months of federal protection: peace. Not the peace of someone who'd escaped consequences, but the peace of someone who'd finally stopped running from the truth. She'd testified before Congress about the human cost of disaster relief fraud, had spoken at universities about corporate ethics, had become a voice for accountability in government contracting. She'd also reconciled with her father. Not forgiven, that was still a work in progress, but they'd begun the slow process of rebuilding their relationship on a foundation of honesty rather than shared denial. Thomas Meridian was using his prison time to work with other inmates on financial literacy programs, teaching men who'd made different kinds of mistakes how to build legitimate futures for themselves. It wasn't redemption, but it was a start. Michael pulled up to the alley and waited, engine running, remembering the fear and uncertainty of that October night. So much had changed since then, not just in his circumstances, but in his understanding of what his life could be. Emma was thriving. The additional income from his federal informant work had allowed Michael to move to a better neighborhood, closer to her school,
which had made their custody arrangement much smoother. Jennifer had even acknowledged that Michael seemed more stable, more present, more like the man she'd married before life had beaten them both down. Emma's grades had improved, her confidence had grown, and most importantly, she'd started talking about her future with excitement rather than anxiety. She wanted to be a lawyer, she'd announced last month, like the people who help Daddy do important stuff. Michael still didn't know exactly how much Emma understood about his work, but she'd clearly picked up on the change in him. He no longer felt like he was just surviving each day. He was building something, contributing something, being someone his daughter could admire. The federal informant work had led to other opportunities. Agent Chen had recommended Michael for a consulting position with the Department of Homeland Security, helping to design undercover operations that required civilian cooperation. The pay was excellent, the work was meaningful, and it allowed Michael to use his unique combination of street knowledge and moral conviction to help protect people who couldn't protect themselves. But he'd also kept driving for Uber, not because he needed the money anymore, but because those late-night rides had become something sacred to him. Every passenger was a potential story, a potential moment where he could make a difference in someone's life. He'd helped domestic violence victims reach safe houses, had talked suicidal teenagers through crisis moments, had driven expectant fathers to hospitals and mourning children to funerals. Most rides were routine. Airport runs, late-night restaurant pickups, people going about their ordinary lives. But Michael had learned to pay attention to the extraordinary moments disguised as ordinary circumstances, to recognize when someone needed more than just a ride. A figure emerged from the shadows of the alley, and Michael's heart jumped with recognition and joy. Sarah looked different. Healthier, more confident, wearing jeans and a casual jacket instead of the expensive business attire she'd favored during her corporate days. Her hair was shorter, her face more relaxed, but her eyes held the same intelligence and determination that had impressed him that first night. She climbed into the passenger seat this time, not the back, and smiled at Michael with genuine warmth. They sat for a moment in comfortable silence, both remembering the terror and confusion of their first meeting, both marveling at how far they'd traveled since then. Sarah told Michael she'd been in Chicago for the congressional hearing on the new disaster relief oversight legislation that had been drafted partly based on her recommendations. The hearing had gone well, but more importantly, she'd finally felt ready to return to the place where her new life had begun. She'd wanted to see Michael again, to thank him properly for what he'd done that night, not just for protecting her or helping her reach safety, but for showing her what real courage looked like. His decision to help a stranger, to risk his daughter's security for someone else's justice, had given her the strength to keep fighting even when federal protection felt like another kind of prison. Michael told Sarah about Emma's school play the week before, how his daughter had dedicated her performance to "My Daddy Who Helps People When They're Scared." He'd cried in the audience, overwhelmed by pride and gratitude for the second chance he'd been given to be the father Emma deserved. Sarah asked Michael if he ever regretted that night, if he ever wished he'd just driven her to the airport and avoided all the complications that followed. Michael's answer was immediate and certain. He told Sarah that every good thing in his current life could be traced back to the choice he had made in that parking garage when he decided to help her despite the risks. His relationship with Emma was stronger, his work was more meaningful, his sense of himself as a man worth respecting had been restored. But beyond personal benefits, Michael had learned something invaluable that night, that ordinary people really could change the world, one choice at a time, one person at a time, one moment of courage at a time. The disaster relief funds that had been recovered were rebuilding communities, saving lives, restoring hope to people who had given up on ever receiving help. That's real impact, measurable change in the world, and it had started with a decision to help one terrified woman in the back seat of a Honda Civic.
Sarah reached over and squeezed Michael's hand, a gesture of friendship and gratitude that needed no words. They talked for another hour, catching up on their separate journeys, sharing stories about their work and their hopes for the future. Sarah was considering law school, inspired by the attorneys who'd helped build the case against the conspiracy. Michael was thinking about expanding his consulting work, maybe even writing a book about his experiences as an informant. But mostly, they were just two people who had found meaning through connection, who discovered that the most important moments in life often came when you chose to care about someone else's problems as much as your own. As dawn began to break over Chicago, Sarah asked Michael for one last favor. Not a ride this time, but a promise. She wanted him to promise that he'd keep doing what he was doing, driving those late-night shifts, staying alert for people who needed more than transportation, and being willing to get involved when involvement was needed. Because the world was full of people like she'd been that October night, scared, alone, carrying burdens too heavy to bear without help. And sometimes the difference between tragedy and triumph was as simple as an Uber driver who cared enough to ask the right questions and make the hard choices. Michael promised, and he meant it. Sarah climbed out of the Honda Civic as the sun painted Chicago's skyline gold, walking back toward her hotel and her new life with the confident stride of someone who had found her purpose. Michael sat in his car for a few more minutes, watching the city wake up around him, thinking about the invisible threads that connected all our lives, the moments of choice that determined whether those connections would lift people up or let them fall. His phone chimed with another ride request. Michael smiled, put the car in drive, and went to see who else might need help getting where they needed to go. Because that's what he did now. That's who he'd chosen to be. And in a world that often felt too big and too complicated for any one person to make a difference, Michael Thompson had discovered the simple truth that Sarah had taught him on that terrifying, transformative October night. Sometimes helping one person is enough to change everything. The end.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.